to make you co-hosts. So hi everyone, Valerie King here with you today, Troop Experience Manager for Girl Scouts Carolina Peaks to Piedmont. And I'm coming to you today with Jaclyn and Emily from the Kellin Foundation. And today we're going to talk about setting boundaries. And I'm really, really excited about this because I struggle with this. So I want to make sure that everybody listens and we have some great conversation around setting boundaries. So ladies, go ahead and teach us.
Awesome. So my name is Emily with the Kellin Foundation, just as a quick reminder. So we provide therapy to everyone all over the triad. We also have some virtual villages coming up this week if you need some extra support after tonight. But hopefully Jackie can get you feeling straight and awesome and knowing all your boundaries. So go ahead, Jackie.
All right, well, thanks everyone for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share this screen, so if you can give me a minute. Let me know that you can see everything. We good? Can you see it all?
Yes, ma'am.
All righty. So today we're going to talk about setting boundaries. And today's session is going to be for the parents. So although we can set boundaries as parents, this is also a skill that we can teach to the kiddos as well. So it'll be kind of a combination of skills. So what are boundaries? Some people are like, what is that? What does that mean? Right? So setting boundaries are limits within relationships. So again, how do you explain that? There's different kinds of boundaries. And so sometimes people say that they're not good at boundaries or setting boundaries. And so when it comes to relationships, there are different kinds of boundaries. So there are what's called physical boundaries, intellectual boundaries, emotional boundaries, material boundaries, and time boundaries. There's another one for adults, but I didn't mention that one today. Just these are kind of pretty universal when it comes to all kinds of relationships. So these are the top main boundaries when it comes to any kind of relationship, whether it's parent-child, between adults, or child to child. Okay, so what do these different boundaries mean? So I have little logos or different pictures to kind of give you a hint. So physical boundaries has to do with people or kind of your physical space. Like some people like to have a lot of space between people, while some people like to have a little bit of space between people. So sometimes that's dependent on, how you grew up or culture. So that has to do, again, with your physical body. Intellectual boundaries has to do with kind of your thoughts and your ideas. So sometimes, like, let's say, growing up, maybe you didn't have you weren't given the opportunity to express your ideas, or maybe your ideas got shot down. So that is an example of where your intellectual boundaries were kind of pushed because it wasn't respected. And this actually, with what's going on in the world, I know that Valerie and I were talking about some of the discussions that were being had in some of the troops circles, that everything that's going on around in the country, we're talking a lot about kind of intellectual boundaries and emotional boundaries. So again, intellectual boundaries is like, what do you think about certain things? What are your thoughts about certain things? And these can get pushed depending on how people treat you. Like, do they say that your thoughts are, you could say, stupid? Do they, are they respected? That kind of thing. And then emotional boundaries, you can guess with the little heart that I have, has to do with feelings. You know, are feelings validated? Are feelings being heard? Are they dismissed? So that has to do with our emotional boundaries. Material boundaries has to do with our things. Sometimes, especially when we're talking about kiddos, sometimes they might go through, you know, purses or closets or just things that are supposed to be, you know, for adults. So that's why we have material boundaries. And this doesn't even have to be, again, between parent and child. It could be between, you know, spouses or significant others. You know, everyone has what they consider their own material boundaries. Like, can people touch it? Can people, what they call, invade it? Can people go inside them? Everyone has their own boundaries on what they feel comfortable about. And then time, this is one that usually gets very difficult to know, especially when it comes to when you have children and you have to kind of bring them places and you have different activities going on. So time is also a boundary. Right? We all have the same amount of time in a day, but everyone has different boundaries on what they're willing to do when it comes to time, how much time they're willing to spend on kids, how much they're willing to spend on themselves, on significant others, etc. Okay, so these are the kinds of boundaries to think about when we're setting them. Most people think that there's only one kind of boundary, but as you see, there are many different kinds of boundaries. So when it comes to setting boundaries first, it's hard to set them if you don't know what your limits are. So you have to know what your limits are. You have to know what your values are, because if you don't know what your values or your limits are, then they get pushed, and sometimes you don't even realize that they're pushed or invaded until you're noticing that something is wrong and that you're upset about something. Listening to your emotions, that has to do a lot with boundaries, is sometimes you know how you're feeling, but sometimes you kind of go against your own values or limits or your own boundaries. Having self-respect, which is kind of, what's the word? What's the word I'm thinking of, Emily? Understandable, or kind of self-explanatory rather. Having respect for others, also self-explanatory. Being assertive, and that's a whole nother topic that I can talk about, or we can talk about at another point, is the difference between assertive communication, aggressive communication, and passive communication. And then considering the long view. So I wanted to bring this up because, you know, during the pandemic, not just what's been going on in the past few weeks, during the pandemic, a lot of boundaries probably have been pushed. Everyone's kind of all in the same space. A lot of boundaries are not being kept, or people are unaware of everyone's boundaries and kind of learning each other's boundaries. So how do we set it, right? And that sometimes that causes a lot of friction and tension and conflict among households because boundaries are being pushed and we're not even aware that boundaries are being pushed. So there are what we call rigid and porous boundaries. So rigid has to do with like pretty much like limits, as in like very rigid, you can't do anything, like it's very strict. Versus porous means that there's so many different ways you can go. So that kind of has to do with communication as well, but we can also relate this in terms of boundaries. So I'll give you an example. So here's a self-assessment. So the reason why I have this blank is because you can use this self-assessment in any kind of relationship. And usually when I do this in therapy, you realize that you have different boundaries for different people in your life. So like for instance, your physical boundaries for your kids are going to look different than your physical boundaries with coworkers or strangers, right? Your intellectual boundaries are going to look different than people that you care about and love versus complete strangers who you don't really know. So you're not going to talk about some of your thoughts and feelings, maybe like we're talking about political stuff, right? um you're not going to talk about that with the person who's next in line with you, right? At least most people won't. Same thing with emotional boundaries. You have certain boundaries and expectations. Who do you share what information with? Some people are willing to share it with other people versus some people aren't. Some people are more restrained on what they share about their feelings or what's going on in their life than others. Same thing with material. That has to do with kind of goods. I know sometimes I've heard of people who might share different items with neighbors or friends and then get upset that maybe the other person might not have the same values or boundaries and then might not take care of it how they want it to be taken care of, or maybe they might take a while to return whatever material good that is, right? And then what comes next is time. Time is very, very, very important in as parents. We all only have a certain amount of time, and some people are more willing to share, their time equally amongst different roles and responsibilities, like they kind of just will say yes for everything that people are being asked to do, while people are a little bit more rigid, meaning when it comes to time, what do you think that means for rigid? If it's time, what would a person who has more rigid limits, what would that person look like? You can either put it in the comment below, or Valerie or Emily, you can guess.
Would it be like more of a hard stop to certain things? So like if you're supposed to end a task at a certain time, you're gonna end it and not touch it again kind of thing?
Yes, yes. And or it could be like when we're talking about relationships, let's say that somebody is saying, I'm supposed to have this appointment at this time, and let's pretend that you were supposed to meet at 4 o'clock, and the person's not there at 4 o'clock. Then the person is super rigid. It's like, you weren't here at 4 o'clock. You didn't respect my boundaries. I'm really upset at you. I'm leaving, you know? So just kind of that example of like, hard stop. But also it could be just, it doesn't have to be that specific on like what time it is, but it could be, someone who wants more, let's say, personal time, and somebody who says, I want to, I say that this is my time. And if you're asking me to go past and you're asking me to watch, like, let's say, come to a party, and I already know what time I have allocated for myself, this person who's more rigid would say, no, I cannot, because I have already allocated my own time. So that, like, they're a little bit more rigid with kind of their boundaries, and they're not as, I guess you can call it, flexible. Okay. So so what I want you to do, as people are kind of watching, is to kind of think about how you are when it comes to, we can use something as simple as children. So how are you with your child? Do you feel that you can just put an X on each different column? Do you feel like when it comes to physical boundaries, do you like, for example, if a kid wants to sit on you or hug you, are you, but you're not really feeling like you want to be hugged or sat on at that moment, are you more porous and just kind of let them be? Or are you more rigid? As in, like, nope, I don't want this right now. Never, ever, ever. I tell you when you come on me. Or, are you more healthy? So that's something that I want you to kind of take a few moments to kind of think about. And if you're watching and you don't have children, it could be you with, a significant other, or it could be friends. in general. Like I know that we've talked about, just boundaries in general. And sometimes, especially with social media, sometimes these boundaries get a little bit meshed together, right? Especially when people feel like maybe their intellectual boundaries are being pushed or their emotional boundaries are being pushed. This happens a lot on social media.
I find this very interesting, Jackie, because I'm not a very physically emotional person. I'm not a hugger or anything like that. But I have found myself that during quarantine, when I do see someone, like I want that hug. And
Mm.
it's like I took it for granted. I could have been getting hugs all this time. And I feel like for that 10 to 30 seconds, somebody else is kind of just holding you together and you can let go. And so I used to be very rigid. I was like, oh, you want a hug? Side hug. But I feel that being aware of whether you're a rigid or porous person, um, and what that balance is to be healthy, that's really important. And I think that as we're talking to volunteers, you know, finding that healthy balance between what are you willing to give up, what are you not willing to give up, what are you willing to do, what are you not willing to do. I just had this conversation like 30 minutes ago of
Wow.
I will find time to make this happen even though I just really don't want to. It's just so important, I'll find a way to make it happen. So I have a tendency to be very porous in that, where go ahead, I won't say no. And so I have to find a way to be a little bit more healthy about that and realize that there's other avenues in my life that I need to be, emotionally healthy, and to make sure that my brain gets a break so that I can be intellectually healthy. So I appreciate this. I would be all over the map on this chart.
Awesome. And sometimes that's what happens. That's why it's an assessment, like I think that the pandemic, thanks for sharing, Valerie, the pandemic really kind of put some things into perspective, right? Kind of like maybe making us think and reevaluate what, again, going back to what are our values? What are our boundaries? Do we want to be that rigid person? Do we want to be that person who was so rigid with their time and you had to go from here to here to here to here to here and didn't really have a lot of that porous, boundaries when it came to maybe, just simple living or living, kind of being with our children? What did us being rigid about our boundaries and having such structured time, what did that mean for our values as families? Right. So,
And well, one of the
yeah.
comments, it also says that she's scared of hugs right now. Right now
Mm,
with the pandemic, I can't blame her. I
me
mean,
neither.
like friends, I know you're healthy. Beware, if I see you, you're getting a hug. Whether you like it or not, I'm going to bear hug you and pin you down. But I understand that aspect as well. And I think that's where possibly being emotionally healthy or intellectually healthy comes into play. You understand, like, maybe hugging isn't the thing to do right now.
Exactly, exactly. And feeling comfortable. Like someone who's saying that they don't feel comfortable with hugs right now, again, knowing their values and being able to feel comfortable and saying, like, I love you, but I don't feel comfortable in hugging. We can do a virtual, high five, a virtual, hug, an air hug. And that's, this always changes and ebbs and flows. And it's not always, again, going to be the same between people, but as we're seeing, depending on kind of what's going on in the world, sometimes our values and our boundaries change, right? So that actually kind of goes back to our this intellectual and emotional, someone who's saying like emotionally they don't feel like they want to be hugged, and being able to feel comfortable and saying that, and then someone being able to respect it and say, I understand how you feel, and that's where we're talking about boundaries, like being, is that person's thoughts and feelings being respected, right? So that actually goes to our next slide, how to set your boundaries. So again, you have to kind of know your boundaries. You have to do that self-assessment. And sometimes maybe you don't know what to say because you're afraid of hurting other people's feelings, right? But it's about knowing what, like practicing. You know that you're probably going to go see somebody and maybe they might want to hug, or they might not have a mask, or whatever it is that you feel uncomfortable about. Preparing yourself kind of so you can practice, kind of role play in your head. What am I going to say? Right. um, and knowing what to do, like if this happens, again, it's kind of preparing yourself. And then having what they call like confident body language, and it comes to that assertiveness, the passiveness versus aggressiveness versus assertiveness. Passive would be like, I don't really want a hug right now. If it's okay with you, that's passive. Versus aggressive is like, I told you I didn't want a hug right now. That is aggressive. Versus assertive. Assertive would be, I love you, you're my friend, but right now I don't feel comfortable in having a hug. I love you very much, and please respect that. I still love you, you know. And
That
again,
can be a
just
very
practicing.
difficult conversation to have. We've been through trainings and things. That's a courageous conversation. It's
Hmm.
one of those things where you have to know what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do, and to say, I respect and love you, but I need you to respect me right now and not give me that hug. I'm just not ready for that. And so that courageous conversation piece of that really comes into play, because it takes courage to have some of those conversations.
Definitely, definitely. It takes courage. It takes confidence, right? And knowing like I am supposed to be listened to. My feelings, my emotions, all of my boundaries are supposed to be respected. So that's why we have that confident body language. If you're going to tell somebody and have that conversation, but you're looking down, it doesn't really have that same effect, right? And again, being respectful, that kind of goes into that communication style. You don't want to blame other people, but you also want to share how you're feeling and thinking and what you would like them to do. And that's why I talked about that planning ahead, and sometimes compromise. I kind of put this as not mandatory, depending on, again, your values and how you're feeling and what you're willing to do. You could compromise, or you could just stop with the conversation and just say no, and that's it. But like I had mentioned, saying the kind of the virtual hug or the air hug, that's a part of compromising, but you don't have to go that far. It could just be like, I said this and then no, you know,
Okay.
it
I
could be
think I think that
simple.
the compromise is a big piece to that. I had gone to a friend of mine's birthday party, and there were six couples there. And after having conversations about how they had been living, I felt like I could let my guard down a little bit and maybe sit within 6 feet of them and be able to give the host a hug and things like that, that made it a little bit easier. So sometimes you can have that compromise after the conversation has happened. I think about where you were talking about the emotional and intellectual piece through social media. Sometimes when you get off of social media and you get back into a conversation, oh, well, you can let your guard back down because it was taken out of context. It was taken the wrong way. So I think that compromise, like you said, isn't mandatory, but we need to think about those things in advance. If we're having that argument that is challenging us, we need to be able to do that. And if I'm one of those people, my phone goes dead at 10 o'clock at night. There is no compromise. That is my family time, my husband, my relaxed time. I don't after 10 o'clock at night. So I think that there's certain places where you can and you can't compromise, and I think that that's really important for people to know, that there are some places that's great to compromise and other places that no, hard stop.
Exactly, exactly. And again, going back to those relationships, who are you willing to be porous with, and who are you willing to be rigid with? And again, going back again to those values, how do you feel about, what kind of relationships do you want to have? um, and again, I can go on, and that's where it comes to therapy, because sometimes some people have difficulty with boundaries, again, because of how they grew up, and maybe they're a little bit more passive in their communication style and in the boundaries. And I don't want to call it people pleasing, but sometimes people pleasing, they're afraid to say no and have that courageous conversation, because again of different things that might have happened. So hopefully this is just kind of a universal topic
Mhm.
that, with what's going on in the world, and also in households, how to show not only ourselves and model it, but also how can we share this with the kiddos as they kind of grow up, and how to set those boundaries with friends at school, peer pressure coming up,
Right.
so how do we set those boundaries and have those conversations?
Well, and I like some of the things that you had in there. Um, I see Girl Scout law in it. To respect myself and others and to respect authority. That's something that is in our Girl Scout law. And I think that as we could use a lot of this when we talk to girls about those particular things. You have to be able to respect yourself and you have to respect someone else. And that includes all of these boundaries. So I can see a number of ways where troop leaders and parents could talk to their girls, to their children, and tell them you have to be respectful of yourself and you have to respect that someone else may feel differently than you, and to respect that sometimes as a parent I have to be authoritative and make it a point that you learn different boundaries. So I'm seeing all of these things kind of flowing through here and seeing how they could really correlate with a Girl Scout lesson that would really make an impact in girls' lives. So I appreciate this so much. I like the self-assessment. That was the best thing I got out of this.
Awesome, awesome.
So I appreciate it.
Thank you. That's the end for me. Does anyone have any questions or have
I
anything
don't
that
see
they want to
any
say?
questions. I see, this is a lot of really good advice and things like that in the comment log. So just know how much we appreciate the two of you coming on and sharing all of this knowledge with us. And for anyone that is interested, you can go to beagirlscout.org if you're interested in more information on becoming a Girl Scout. And you can go to the Kellin Foundation.org for more information on the Kellin Foundation. And again, I'm Valerie from Girl Scouts Carolinas Peaks to Piedmont, and we have Jackie and Emily with us today, talking about how to set boundaries in a healthy manner. So join us again next week for another Wellness Wednesday. I can't wait to see what next week's topic is. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments and we'll be glad to answer them in any way, shape, or form. You can call us at 1-800-672-2148 or email info@girlscoutsptp.org. There is a link directly to the Kellin Foundation in the comments. So please, please, please let us know how you enjoyed this. What other information would you like? Is there a topic that could keep your mind healthy that you would like to talk or learn more about? We would be glad to share that with the Kellin Foundation. So thank you, ladies, so much for joining us today. And I hope that you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.